The mist arrives before dawn, crawling up from the Sengoku River through streets that haven't yet stirred. It wraps itself around the white walls rising from the hillside, obscuring the stone foundations, blurring the edges between earth and architecture. For a moment, the castle appears to float, weightless against the gray sky. This is the image that has defined Himeji for 400 years. The Heron Castle, the White Egret, a fortress so impossibly elegant it seems to have descended from the clouds rather than been dragged from the earth by human hands. But step closer. Listen beyond the silence. Beneath that perfect whiteness, within those soaring walls, inside the mathematical precision of interlocking timbers and stone, there exists another story entirely. A story not of floating grace, but of crushing weight. Not of effortless beauty, but of relentless calculation. Not of timeless permanence, but of constant, exhausting labor to prevent collapse. The morning fog will burn away. The white walls will emerge fully into daylight, photographed by millions, admired from every angle. Yet the deeper truth remains hidden, as it always has been. This castle, like all monuments that survive long enough to be called eternal, rests not on stone foundations alone, but on an invisible architecture of human effort, financial desperation, and the quiet decisions of those who chose preservation over abandonment, even when abandonment would have been easier. Who truly paid for this dream? And what does it cost to keep it alive today? The castle you encounter today occupies 41 acres of land in the heart of Himeji City. Its main keep rises 115 feet above the stone base, a 5-story visible exterior concealing 7 interior floors. The entire defensive complex, including 83 buildings distributed across multiple baileys, represents the most complete surviving example of Japanese castle architecture from the early Edo period. When you walk through the Hishi Gate and begin the winding approach toward the central tower, you traverse nearly half a mile of defensive corridors, passing beneath 14 separate gates, each positioned to funnel potential attackers into predetermined kill zones. The white plaster coating every surface consumed 400 tons of material during the original construction, mixed with crushed oyster shells brought from the inland sea 30 miles south. The main tower alone contains more than 640 massive wooden pillars, some reaching 50 feet in length, carved from cypress trees that had grown for 3 centuries before they were felled. This was never meant to be subtle. This was architecture as psychological warfare, designed to communicate absolute authority before a single arrow was fired. The white walls gleam with a brightness that forces the eye to squint in full sunlight, a deliberate choice. White plaster reflected heat in summer, repelled fire, and most importantly, announced from miles away that someone possessed the wealth and power to coat an entire fortress in material that required constant maintenance, constant expense, constant labor. Beauty here was never the point. Dominance was the point. Beauty was merely the weapon chosen to express it. The man who commissioned this overwhelming statement was Ikeda Terumasa, appointed Lord of Harima Province in the year 1600. He was 31 years old, a veteran of countless battles, son-in-law to the new shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, and acutely aware that his position depended entirely on maintaining the delicate balance between demonstrating loyalty to the Tokugawa regime and projecting enough independent strength that he could never be dismissed as irrelevant. The castle he would build served both purposes simultaneously. It would defend the western approaches to the new capital, anchoring the shogunate's control over restive domains further from Edo. And it would remind everyone, shogun included, that Ikeda Terumasa commanded resources substantial enough to transform a hillside into an impregnable fortress within 9 years. Terumasa was not an idealist. Contemporary records describe a man intensely practical, given to careful calculation rather than grand gestures. He had inherited a domain assessed at 520,000 koku, a measure of rice production that translated directly into military and economic power. One koku represented enough rice to feed one person for 1 year. His domain, theoretically, could sustain over 500,000 people. But theory and practice diverged sharply. Tax collection, crop failures, the need to maintain samurai retainers, infrastructure costs, and the shogun's frequent demands for contributions to various projects all meant that actual disposable wealth was far smaller. Building a castle of unprecedented scale would require every spare resource Terumasa could extract, borrow, or commandeer, and would leave his domain financially vulnerable for decades. He built it anyway. Construction began in 1601 and continued for 8 years of relentless coordinated effort. The choice of location itself presented immediate challenges. The hill chosen for the main keep, called Himeyama, rose only 60 feet above the surrounding plain, high enough for visibility and defense, but low enough that creating the illusion of a mountain fortress would require building upward at extraordinary cost. The initial work focused entirely on foundation. Teams of stonemasons, recruited from across western Japan, began the slow process of quarrying and shaping granite blocks, some weighing over 10 tons. These were dragged to the site on wooden sleds, hauled up earthen ramps, and fitted together without mortar in a technique called nosura zukuri, where irregular natural stones are positioned to interlock and distribute weight across the entire structure. The stone base of the main keep alone consumed 14 months and required approximately 2,000 workers rotating through the site in shifts. Each stone had to be tested for stability, positioned, repositioned, sometimes rejected entirely and replaced. The ramps grew steeper as the base rose higher. Injuries became routine. Deaths, though not officially recorded in detail, are referenced obliquely in temple records from the period, which note sudden increases in memorial services for workers from distant provinces. The bodies were returned home when possible, or buried in unmarked plots near the construction site when not. Above the stone foundation, a different form of precision began. The wooden superstructure required timber on a scale that dramatically reshaped the forests of Harima province. The central pillar of the main keep, called the Toshin Bashira, rises through all 7 interior floors as a single massive cypress trunk, nearly 3 feet in diameter at its base. Finding a tree of sufficient size, straightness, and strength became an expedition in itself. The timber was identified in a mountain valley 20 miles north, felled with elaborate ceremony, and transported to Himeji by teams of oxen over the course of 6 weeks. Similar expeditions brought hundreds of other large timbers, each selected for specific structural purposes. Cedar for roofing, pine for flooring, oak for gates, bamboo for scaffolding and interior details. The carpenters who shaped this timber formed a distinct hierarchy. Master carpenters, called torio, possessed knowledge passed through generations, an understanding of wood grain, stress distribution, and joinery techniques that could not be written down or simplified. Beneath them worked journeymen, each specialized in particular tasks, shaping pillars, cutting complex joints, fitting floor panels, carving bracket systems that supported the massive overhanging eaves. At the bottom, labored apprentices and general workers who hauled materials, cleared sawdust, maintained tools, and performed the 1,000 small tasks that kept the entire operation moving. The joinery throughout the castle relies entirely on interlocking wooden connections without nails or metal fasteners in the primary structure. Each joint represents hours of careful cutting, fitting, testing, and adjustment. The main keep contains thousands of these connections, each one a small structural puzzle where failure would compromise the entire assembly. A master carpenter might complete 3 or 4 major joints in a single day. Multiply that effort across the scale of the entire fortress, and the timeline becomes less mysterious. Speed was never possible. Only relentless, patient accumulation of completed work. Paying for this required mechanisms of extraction that touched every corner of the domain. Tarumasa raised taxes incrementally throughout the construction period, justified as necessary for defense and provincial security. Farmers already operating on narrow margins found themselves delivering larger portions of each harvest to domain granaries. Merchants faced new fees and levies. Villages were assessed for contributions of labor, sending rotating groups of workers to Himeji for months at a time, unpaid except for basic food and shelter. This was not slavery in the formal sense, but neither was it voluntary. Refusal would mark a village as uncooperative, potentially triggering punitive tax increases or loss of trading privileges. The workers themselves came from a spectrum of circumstances. Some were skilled professionals, stonemasons and carpenters who traveled from site to site, following construction projects across Japan, earning wages that allowed them to support families and perhaps train apprentices. They worked for payment, though that payment was often delayed or delivered partially in rice rather than coin. Others were semi-skilled laborers, farmers during planting and harvest seasons who hired themselves out for construction work during the agricultural off-season. They needed the income, meager as it was, to survive lean winters. At the bottom were the fully conscripted, villagers fulfilling their labor obligations, working not for wages but to avoid penalties, housed in temporary barracks near the construction site, fed rice gruel twice daily, sleeping on straw mats in structures that leaked when it rained. Contemporary records, preserved in the Ikeda family archives and later transcribed during the Meiji period, provide fragments of the human cost. An entry from 1604 notes a work stoppage due to an outbreak of dysentery in the workers' barracks, affecting over 300 men. Treatment was minimal. Those who recovered returned to work. Those who did not were replaced. Another entry from 1606 mentions a carpenter who fell from scaffolding on the 4th floor of the main keep, landing on stone pavement below. The entry records the incident primarily because it delayed work on that section for 2 days, while debris was cleared and new workers assigned. There are no names. The individual lives dissolve into collective numbers, into labor hours and resource allocation. This is not because Ikeda Tarumasa was uniquely cruel, but because the logic of monumental construction operates at a scale where individual suffering becomes a category of overhead, expected and absorbed into the larger project. To build something permanent within a single human lifespan requires treating human effort as abundant and replaceable, even when, for the individuals involved, their labor represents everything they have to offer. The castle was completed in 1609. Tarumasa died 4 years later, at age 44, likely from illness rather than battle. He lived long enough to see his fortress finished, but not long enough to understand whether it would fulfill its strategic purpose. His successors in the Ikeda line held Himeji for only 2 generations before being transferred to other domains, a common practice by which the shogunate prevented regional lords from becoming too entrenched in any single location. The castle passed to the Honda clan, then to the Sakakibara, then to the Matsudaira, each new lord inheriting both the symbolic power of the White Fortress and the relentless financial burden of maintaining it. Because the costs did not end with construction. A castle is not a static object. It is a living system requiring constant input of labor and resources to prevent decay. The white plaster coating, so striking when fresh, began to crack and stain within years. Rain seeped into gaps, moisture penetrated the walls, wood began to rot. replastering became an ongoing necessity, requiring teams of workers to scrape away damaged sections and apply new coats, a process that had to be repeated on different sections of the castle every few years. The roof tiles, layered in precise overlapping patterns, shifted during earthquakes, common in the region, creating leaks that could spread damage deep into the wooden structure if not addressed immediately. The stone walls, seemingly permanent, actually required continuous monitoring and repair as settling foundations and seismic activity created instabilities. The domain government maintained a permanent staff assigned exclusively to castle maintenance. By the mid-17th century, this staff included approximately 60 full-time workers, carpenters, plasterers, tile specialists, stonemasons, painters, cleaners, and general laborers. These were salaried positions, paid from domain tax revenue, representing a fixed annual expense that never diminished. In addition to direct maintenance workers, the castle required administrative staff to manage supplies, coordinate schedules, and oversee quality. It required guards, even in peacetime, to maintain security and project authority. It required groundskeepers to maintain the extensive gardens and training grounds within the castle complex. Conservative estimates placed the total permanent castle staff at over 200 people by the mid-Edo period. Feeding these people, paying their salaries, purchasing materials for repairs, all of this demanded a continuous flow of revenue. The domain's rice production, though substantial, was not infinite. Years of poor harvest created immediate crises. The domain would need to borrow rice from merchants, accumulating debt at interest, or reduce services elsewhere, cutting stipends to lower-ranking samurai, deferring infrastructure repairs in rural villages. The castle, once built, became the fixed point around which all other priorities rotated. It could not be abandoned without catastrophic loss of prestige. It could not be reduced in scale without enormous effort and dubious benefit. It simply had to be maintained, regardless of cost, regardless of competing needs. The Tokugawa shogunate, seeking to prevent regional lords from accumulating dangerous levels of wealth and military power, implemented a system called sankin kotai, alternate attendance, requiring each lord to spend every other year in Edo, maintaining 2 complete households and traveling back and forth with elaborate retinues. For the lords of Himeji, this meant constructing and staffing a second major residence in Edo, funding biannual journeys covering over 300 miles and supporting hundreds of retainers in both locations simultaneously. The expense was crushing by design. A domain that bankrupted itself on ceremonial obligations had no resources left for rebellion. The Honda clan, lords of Himeji from 1617 to 1639, struggled particularly under this system. Records show them borrowing heavily from Osaka merchants to finance their mandatory expenses, offering future rice harvests as collateral. When harvests fell short, debts accumulated, interest compounded. By the time the Honda were transferred to another domain, they owed sums they would spend decades repaying. The castle, meanwhile, continued consuming resources. A major roof repair in 1632 required over 15,000 replacement tiles, manufactured at regional kilns and transported to Himeji by boat and cart. The cost nearly equaled the domain's entire annual discretionary budget. The Matsudaira clan, arriving in 1749, attempted a different approach. They sought to make portions of the castle complex economically productive. Lower baileys were leased to merchants for storage facilities. Sections of the outer grounds were converted to gardens that produced vegetables and herbs for sale in local markets. These efforts generated modest income, but nowhere near enough to offset ongoing expenses. A detailed financial record from 1763 shows annual castle maintenance costs at approximately 12,000 ryo. gold coins used for major transactions, while total domain discretionary revenue after mandatory expenses stood at roughly 18,000 ryo. 2/3 of available resources absorbed by a single building complex. The castle never fought a battle. This essential fact haunts its entire history. It was designed, engineered, and built to withstand siege, to funnel attackers through kill zones, to project invincible strength. The defensive architecture is brilliant and thorough. The gates form a maze. The walls are positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Stone-dropping holes perforate the ceilings of key passages, yet the Tokugawa peace held. No army ever tested those defenses. The castle performed its function entirely through symbolic presence, by existing so impressively that challenging it became unthinkable. This is perhaps the most profound irony. The vast human cost, the decades of financial strain, the endless maintenance, all sustained a fortress whose value was purely psychological. It had to appear strong enough to deter attack, which meant it had to actually be strong enough, which meant the expense was real and continuous, even though the threat remained hypothetical. You cannot maintain a convincing illusion of power with a crumbling facade. The performance required genuine substance, and genuine substance demanded genuine sacrifice. The people who paid most directly were those whose labor and taxes sustained the system. The farmers who delivered increasing portions of their harvest during poor years as well as good. The craftsmen whose loan debts to the domain meant they had little choice but to accept repair contracts at rates that barely covered costs. The low-ranking samurai whose stipends were reduced when domain finances tightened, who found themselves sliding into poverty while maintaining the appearances required by their status. The merchants who extended credit to the domain during cash shortages, knowing that refusal would cost them trading privileges, but knowing also that repayment was uncertain and often delayed years beyond the original terms. None of these people decided to build Himeji Castle. None of them gained direct benefit from its existence. Their relationship to the monument was compulsory. It stood, therefore they paid. Its survival depended on their continued extraction. This was understood by everyone involved not as injustice, but as the natural order, the way great things have always been built, the necessary price of civilization and stability. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 shattered that order completely. The new imperial government, determined to modernize Japan along Western lines, abolished the feudal domain system and dismantled samurai privilege. Castles, symbols of the old regime, suddenly had no administrative function. Many were demolished deliberately, their materials sold to fund modernization projects. Others were simply abandoned, left to decay as the new government focused resources on railroads, factories, telegraphs, and military infrastructure. Himeji survived this period by narrow margins and bureaucratic accident. The castle and its grounds were initially transferred to the army, which briefly considered using the complex as a military base. Engineers inspected the structure and concluded that adaptation for modern military purposes would be impractical. The wooden buildings were fire hazards. The layout, designed for medieval warfare, made no sense for troops using rifles and artillery. Demolition was proposed. Detailed plans were drawn up for clearing the site and selling the valuable land in the heart of rapidly growing Himeji City. The salvation came not from aesthetic appreciation, but from cost calculation. Demolition would be expensive. The walls were thick. The timbers were massive. Labor costs for systematic dismantling, when weighed against the uncertain value of the cleared land, made the project financially questionable. Postponement was suggested. The proposal sat in bureaucratic review. Meanwhile, a small group of local historians and former domain officials began lobbying for preservation, arguing that the castle represented irreplaceable architectural heritage. Their efforts alone would likely have failed, but combined with the government's reluctance to spend money on demolition, they created just enough delay. In 1877, the castle was formally designated as Army property, but left essentially unused. A token garrison maintained minimal presence. Basic maintenance continued, though it drastically reduced levels. The vast staff of the feudal period was gone. A handful of caretakers, paid minimal wages by the army, attempted to address the most critical repairs. Roofs leaked, plaster crumbled. Without the continuous labor of the Edo period, decay accelerated visibly. Visitors during the 1880s, few as they were, described a melancholy atmosphere, a sense of grandeur fading into ruin. The 1930s brought renewed attention, driven by rising nationalism and interest in traditional Japanese culture. The castle was designated a national treasure in 1931, triggering the first systematic preservation effort in decades. Engineers and craftsmen trained in traditional techniques surveyed the entire complex, documenting damage and planning repairs. Funding came from both government sources and private donations, the latter solicited through campaigns emphasizing patriotic duty and cultural pride. The work proceeded slowly through the decade, interrupted periodically by budget constraints, but never entirely abandoned. The Second World War brought existential threat in a form the castle had never been designed to resist. American firebombing campaigns systematically destroyed Japanese cities throughout 1945. Himeji, an industrial center with rail connections and military facilities, was bombed on multiple occasions. On the night of July 3, 1945, incendiary bombs fell across the city, creating firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. The castle, elevated on its hill and constructed primarily of fire-resistant plaster over massive timbers, survived. Buildings immediately surrounding the complex burned. The heat was intense enough to crack some of the stones in the outer walls, but the main keep and core structures remained intact. This survival was part luck, part the inherent fire resistance of the construction, and part deliberate choice by American planners who, according to post-war records, considered the castle's potential cultural value when selecting bombing targets within the city. The decision not to target it directly was marginal, driven by individuals within the planning process who argued for preservation, a gesture that seems almost incomprehensibly fragile given the scale of destruction as occurring across Japan during those months. In the immediate aftermath of the war, preservation fell to its lowest priority in decades. The nation was rebuilding from catastrophic destruction. Resources went to housing, food production, infrastructure repair. Himeji Castle stood, undamaged by bombs but suffering from years of deferred maintenance, its future uncertain. The occupation government initially viewed castles and other feudal symbols with suspicion, associating them with militarism and the ideologies that had led to war. Discussions occurred regarding possible demolition or conversion to non-cultural purposes. Once again, advocates for preservation assembled arguments. They emphasized the castle's architectural uniqueness, its value as a historical document, and increasingly, its potential as a tourist attraction that could bring economic benefit to Himeji City. This last argument proved decisive. Post-war Japan, desperately needing foreign currency, recognized tourism as a possible industry. A well-preserved castle, properly marketed, could attract both domestic and international visitors, generating revenue through admission fees, local spending, and broader promotion of Japanese culture. The major restoration project known as the Showa renovation began in 1956 and continued for 8 years. This was the most comprehensive preservation effort ever attempted on the castle, involving structural analysis, timber replacement, complete replastering, roof repair, foundation stabilization, and the installation of modern infrastructure, including electrical systems and fire suppression. The work employed hundreds of craftsmen, many trained specifically for this project in traditional techniques that had nearly disappeared during the modernization of the construction industry. The central pillar of the main keep, the massive cypress trunk that had stood since 1609, was found to be severely compromised by rot and insect damage at its base. Replacing it would require disassembling much of the tower's interior structure. Engineers debated the options. Complete replacement would ensure long-term stability, but risk damaging other components during the process and would erase an irreplaceable historical element. Partial reinforcement, adding steel supports beside the original timber, would preserve the historic material, but represented a compromise of authenticity. The decision made reflects the central tension in all preservation work. They chose reinforcement over replacement. Steel columns were installed immediately adjacent to the original pillar, bearing most of the structural load while allowing the ancient timber to remain in place. The compromise satisfied neither purists nor engineers entirely, but it balanced competing values: structural safety, historical authenticity, and practical feasibility. The work cost over 500 million yen, a staggering sum for 1950s Japan, funded through a combination of national government appropriation, local contributions, and emerging tourism revenue. The castle reopened in 1964, the same year Tokyo hosted the Summer Olympics, a moment when Japan was consciously presenting itself to the world as a modern nation with deep historical roots. Himeji Castle became a symbol deployed in that presentation, featured in promotional materials, visited by dignitaries, celebrated as proof that modernization and tradition could coexist. Tourism increased dramatically. Admission fees, nominal but continuous, began generating reliable revenue. Local businesses benefited from visitors needing food, lodging, souvenirs. The castle, for perhaps the first time in its existence, began to generate economic value that partially offset its maintenance costs, but only partially. The fundamental equation remained unchanged. A wooden structure of this scale requires endless maintenance. In 1986, another major inspection revealed that the white plaster coating, renewed during the Showa renovation, was already degrading. The original plaster techniques, using specific ratios of lime, crushed oyster shell, and natural fibers, interacted with modern air pollution in ways not fully understood. Acid rain, a product of industrial emissions, corroded the surface at accelerated rates. A new restoration campaign began in 1999, focusing primarily on replastering the entire exterior, work that would take over a decade. The most recent major preservation project, known as the Heisei renovation, spanned from 2009 to 2015. The main keep was wrapped in scaffolding and protective coverings, becoming invisible to visitors for portions of this period. Tourism revenue dropped as a result, creating immediate financial stress for city budgets that had come to depend on that income. The city of Himeji faced a dilemma: suspend the work and preserve tourism revenue, or continue the work knowing that short-term economic pain was necessary for long-term survival of the structure itself. They continued. The work involved removing all roof tiles, over 70,000 individual pieces, inspecting each one, replacing those too damaged to reuse, and reinstalling them with improved weatherproofing. Every exposed timber surface was inspected for rot, insects, and structural integrity. Damaged sections were carefully removed and replaced with new timber, specially sourced from old-growth forests, managed specifically to provide materials for historic preservation. The entire exterior was replastered using techniques as close as possible to the original methods, though modern analysis and testing allowed for subtle improvements in durability and weather resistance. The total cost exceeded 3 billion yen, approximately $30 million, funded primarily by the national government with contributions from Himeji City and private donors. The work employed specialists in traditional crafts whose knowledge would otherwise have no market in modern construction. Plasterers who understood the specific mixtures and application techniques, tile makers who could replicate the exact profiles and firing methods of Edo period production, carpenters trained in hand-tool joinery who could match the original work seamlessly. This was preservation as intensive care, a continuous intervention preventing natural decay. Without this effort, the castle would deteriorate visibly within years, catastrophically within decades. The wood would rot, the plaster would fall away, the roof would leak and eventually collapse, the walls would destabilize and crumble. Nature reclaims all human constructions eventually, unless humans actively, continuously, expensively prevent it. The castle today operates as a museum and tourist site managed by Himeji City in cooperation with the National Agency for Cultural Affairs. Annual operating costs, including maintenance, staffing, utilities, insurance, and preservation planning, exceed 300 million yen, roughly $3 million. Admission fees generate approximately 250 million yen annually, varying with visitor numbers. The shortfall is covered by municipal and national government subsidies justified as cultural preservation and economic development through tourism. The permanent staff includes 43 people: administrators, ticket collectors, maintenance workers, security guards, and educational program coordinators. During peak tourist seasons, temporary staff increases to over 70. These employees represent the contemporary incarnation of the invisible labor that has always sustained the castle. They repair damage, clean surfaces, monitor for signs of deterioration, manage visitor flow to prevent excessive wear, and maintain the complex systems that allow public access while protecting fragile historical materials. The castle receives over 1 million visitors annually, a number that creates its own preservation challenges. Foot traffic wears wooden floors. Body heat and humidity from crowds affect interior climate. Touching walls, though prohibited, occurs constantly and accumulates oils and dirt that penetrate plaster. The building must be cleaned continuously. High traffic areas require more frequent maintenance than calculations based purely on age and weather would suggest. The visitors who come to admire the castle are simultaneously, incrementally wearing it away. Modern technology provides tools unavailable to earlier preservationists. Sensors monitor temperature, humidity, and structural movement continuously, alerting staff to changes that might indicate developing problems. Digital scanning creates detailed three-dimensional records of every surface, documentation that allows for precise analysis and planning. Advanced materials, carefully selected to be compatible with historic fabric, offer improved durability for some applications. Yet these technologies are expensive and require specialized expertise to implement and interpret. The fundamental challenge remains: preventing decay costs money and labor continuously, while the building itself generates limited revenue and serves primarily non-economic purposes. The question persists: who truly paid for this dream? The answer spans 4 centuries and includes thousands of individuals whose names are mostly lost. The farmers taxed to fund initial construction and ongoing maintenance. The workers who quarried stone and shaped timber, some of whom died in the process. The domain lords who bankrupted themselves, maintaining the complex while fulfilling shogunal obligations. The merchants who extended credit that often went unpaid. The Meiji-era advocates who fought for preservation when demolition seemed more rational. The craftsmen trained in traditional techniques specifically to sustain a single building. The taxpayers whose contributions fund modern preservation, work they may never personally benefit from. And what did it cost? The tangible costs can be calculated. Millions of labor hours, billions of yen across multiple currencies and economic systems, materials extracted and transported across hundreds of miles, forests depleted to provide timber. The intangible costs resist measurement, opportunities forgone because resources went to the castle instead, individual lives shaped by the demands of maintaining a monument, social structures reinforced by the hierarchies required to organize such sustained effort. The castle embodies a fundamental tension in all cultural preservation. We value these structures because they connect us to history, because they represent achievements of skill and organization, because they offer beauty and meaning that transcends immediate utility. Yet maintaining them requires extracting resources from the present, diverting funds that might address contemporary needs, asking people living now to sacrifice for the sake of preserving the past. This is not obviously rational. It requires justifications beyond simple cost-benefit analysis. Arguments about identity, continuity, education, inspiration, the intangible values that make human life more than mere survival and reproduction. Himeji Castle survives because enough people, across multiple generations, made the decision that its survival mattered more than the costs it imposed. That decision was never unanimous. It was contested, questioned, sometimes deferred. The castle came within years, perhaps months, of demolition on multiple occasions. Its preservation was not inevitable but contingent, dependent on specific individuals making specific arguments at specific moments, swaying decisions that could easily have gone differently. Consider what would have been lost. The main keep represents a structural achievement that still challenges modern engineers. The massive timbers are joined in configurations that distribute seismic loads through controlled flexibility, allowing the building to sway during earthquakes without collapsing. This earthquake-resistant design, developed through centuries of trial and error, influenced modern understanding of structural dynamics. The castle is not merely a historical artifact, but a functional demonstration of principles that remain relevant. The aesthetic achievement is equally significant. The white walls, the elegant roof lines, the proportions and spatial relationships create an experience of beauty that affects millions of visitors. This is not abstract or elitist. People travel from across the world to see Himeji Castle, and many describe the experience as profound, moving, transformative. Beauty at this level, executed with this precision, is rare enough to have genuine value. It enriches human experience in ways that, while difficult to quantify, are real and meaningful. The castle also preserves knowledge. The construction techniques, the organizational methods, the joinery details, all represent accumulated wisdom that would otherwise vanish. Craftsmen working on preservation projects study the original construction, learning approaches that modern industrial methods have abandoned, but which sometimes prove superior for specific applications. This is practical knowledge with ongoing utility, maintained not in textbooks, but in the physical structure itself. Yet none of these values make preservation easy or obvious. The case must be remade continuously to each new generation, justifying the expense and effort required. The castle cannot defend itself. It depends entirely on people choosing to defend it, and choice always implies the possibility of choosing otherwise. The modern visitor experience, carefully managed to balance access and preservation, reveals the compromises required to sustain the castle. You purchase a ticket at the main entrance, priced to generate revenue while remaining affordable enough to encourage visitation. You pass through metal detectors and bag checks, security measures necessary for high-profile cultural sites. You remove your shoes before entering wooden structures, wearing provided slippers to reduce wear on historic floors. You follow marked paths through the interior, prevented from entering certain rooms where access would accelerate deterioration. You are prohibited from touching walls or pillars, a rule enforced by guards and signage. Photography is allowed, but flash is prohibited to prevent light damage to sensitive surfaces. These restrictions transform the experience from what it would have been during the Edo period, when the castle was a functioning military and administrative complex. Then, you would not have entered at all unless you had specific business or status. The exclusivity was absolute. Now, access is universal but controlled. The building serves a new function as museum and educational site rather than fortress, and that function requires adaptation. The admission fees, while substantial in aggregate, cover only a portion of operating costs. The rest comes from government subsidies, justified through arguments about cultural heritage, tourism economics, and international prestige. These arguments must be remade annually during budget negotiations. Funding is never guaranteed. Preservation competes with schools, healthcare, infrastructure, social services, all the immediate needs that governments exist to address. The case for maintaining a 400-year-old castle must be made persuasively enough to secure resources that could otherwise fund contemporary priorities. This is the ongoing cost, the price paid not once during construction, but continuously, every year, every budget cycle. The castle survives only because that argument continues to succeed, and its success depends on the castle remaining impressive, well-maintained, worthy of the investment. Any visible decline would weaken the case. The imperative to maintain pristine appearance is not purely aesthetic, but existential. The castle must justify its own preservation through the quality of its preservation, a circular dependency that creates constant pressure. Walk through Himeji Castle today, and you experience layers of time compressed into a single physical place. The stone walls date to the early 17th century, placed by workers whose names are forgotten. The timber structure includes both original elements from 1609 and replacement pieces from dozens of subsequent repairs, centuries of work layered invisibly within the same frame. The plaster coating is almost entirely from the Heisei renovation, fresh and bright, chemically similar to the original but physically only a few years old. The electrical systems, fire suppression, climate monitoring, all are contemporary, hidden within historic fabric. This is not a pure artifact from the past, but a living accumulation of continuous effort to maintain connection with the past. The authenticity is complex. Some elements are genuinely ancient, others are recent but traditional. Others are modern interventions necessary for survival. The castle as a whole is authentic in a deeper sense than simple age. It represents 400 years of people choosing preservation, adapting techniques, accepting costs, solving problems, passing knowledge and responsibility forward. The question of who paid transforms into a question of who continues to pay. The farmer who delivered tax rice in 1650 contributed as surely as the taxpayer whose yen fund preservation worked today. The carpenter who shaped joints in 1603 connects directly to the craftsman who replaced damaged timbers in 2012 across 4 centuries of continuous maintenance. The chain is unbroken, not because preservation was easy, but because enough people, at enough critical moments, chose continuation over abandonment. Consider the alternative. Hundreds of Japanese castles that once existed are gone, demolished for various reasons across the Meiji and post-war periods. Most are remembered only in historical records and old photographs. A few survive as ruins, foundations and fragments suggesting former grandeur. The reasons for survival or destruction were often arbitrary, dependent on local circumstances, financial situations, presence or absence of preservation advocates, bureaucratic decisions that could easily have gone differently. Himeji survived partly because it was impressive enough that abandoning it felt like genuine loss, partly because various individuals at critical moments argued persuasively for preservation, partly because costs and circumstances aligned to make preservation marginally more feasible than demolition, partly through luck escaping bombing that destroyed neighboring structures. This fragility haunts the story. The castle appears permanent, massive, stable. Yet its survival depended on narrow margins, on decisions made by specific people whose choices were not predetermined. The appearance of permanence is an achievement, a construction as deliberate as the white walls themselves. Maintaining that appearance requires hiding the constant effort, the repairs, the interventions, the choices and costs that make survival possible. The castle, in this sense, is a performance. It performs timelessness through careful maintenance. It performs effortless beauty through intensive labor. It performs permanence through continuous adaptation. The performance is convincing because the effort behind it remains largely invisible, as it was designed to be. The Edo period workers who carried stone are absent from the experience of contemporary visitors. The modern maintenance staff work primarily when the castle is closed to the public. The budget negotiations, the preservation debates, the technical analyses all occur backstage, invisible to those who simply come to admire. What does the castle mean now in the 21st century? Its military function is obsolete, a curiosity from a period when warfare operated at scales and speeds that allowed massive stone fortifications to serve defensive purposes. Its administrative function is gone, replaced by modern government operating from purpose-built offices. What remains is symbolic function, aesthetic function, educational function, and the less tangible function of providing connection to history, to place, to continuity. These functions matter, but differently than they would have to Ikeda Terumasa, who built the castle to project power and secure territory. The modern visitors who photograph the white walls from every angle, who climb the steep stairs through the interior, who study the explanatory plaques describing construction techniques and historical context, engage with the castle as cultural heritage rather than active power structure. This represents a fundamental transformation in meaning and purpose, a shift that allowed survival by making the castle useful in new ways. Tourism, the primary economic justification for preservation, extracts value from the castle without consuming it. Visitors pay admission, enriching local economy, generating tax revenue, justifying preservation expenditure, all while leaving the physical structure essentially unchanged. This is a sustainable model only if visitor numbers remain high enough to generate significant revenue, but controlled enough to prevent damage, a balance requiring constant management. The castle has become a commodity, packaged and marketed as an experience to be consumed. This commercialization makes some scholars and preservationists uncomfortable, feeling it diminishes the historical and cultural significance. Yet the alternative, maintaining the castle without public access, would eliminate the primary justification for public funding. The castle survives by being accessible, and accessibility requires tourism infrastructure, marketing, visitor management, all the apparatus of the modern heritage industry. The people working today to maintain Himeji Castle are the latest inheritors of a tradition spanning 400 years. The plasterer who carefully mixes lime and oyster shell, matching ratios documented from earlier restorations, connects to the plasterers of 1609 through shared technique and purpose. The administrator negotiating budgets with city officials echoes the domain officials who managed construction accounts in the Edo period. The guard who monitors visitor behavior, protecting fragile surfaces from accidental damage, performs the same essential function as guards who once restricted access entirely. These modern workers are, in most cases, not descended from the original builders. There is no direct lineage. But there is continuity of purpose and technique, a passing forward of knowledge and responsibility that creates connection across generations. The work they perform is not glamorous. It is often tedious, sometimes uncomfortable, occasionally dangerous. It is also essential. Without their labor, the castle would begin deteriorating immediately and visibly. They are paid, unlike many of the original construction workers. They work in safer conditions with better tools and understanding of structural principles. They have legal protections and rights that did not exist in the feudal period. Yet the fundamental relationship remains. Their effort sustains the monument, and the monument demands continuous effort. They have chosen this work, or at least chosen to remain in it, but the castle's needs are not negotiable. The decay never pauses. The maintenance never finishes. The future of Himeji Castle depends on decisions not yet made, problems not yet fully understood. Climate change brings more intense rainfall, higher temperatures, shifting patterns of humidity and freeze-thaw cycles that affect wooden structures in ways difficult to predict. Air pollution, though reduced in recent decades, continues affecting the white plaster coating. Earthquake risk, always present in Japan, threatens catastrophic damage that would require decades and billions of yen to repair. The economic model, dependent on tourism revenue, proves vulnerable to disruptions. The COVID-19 pandemic reduced visitor numbers to a fraction of normal levels for over a year, creating immediate financial stress. Government subsidies increased to cover the shortfall, but such interventions are not indefinitely sustainable. The castle requires economic stability to support preservation stability, and economic stability is always uncertain. The knowledge necessary for traditional preservation techniques resides increasingly in aging practitioners. Training new craftsmen in methods rarely used outside heritage preservation is expensive and time-consuming. The number of people willing to pursue such careers in an economy offering many alternatives remains small. Knowledge transmission becomes a preservation challenge parallel to the physical structure. Both the building and the expertise to maintain it must be sustained, and both face threats. Yet the castle has survived challenges before. It has outlasted the regime that built it. It has weathered economic collapses, wars, and fundamental transformations in how society functions. It has adapted its purpose while maintaining its form. This resilience suggests that with continued effort and resources, survival remains possible. The fundamental insight remains: great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. Appreciation is necessary but insufficient. Survival requires money, labor, expertise, institutional support, legal protection, and the continuous decision by people in positions of authority that preservation matters more than alternative uses of the same resources. These are human choices made repeatedly, vulnerable to changing circumstances and priorities. The castle exists because people chose and continue choosing to make it exist. The original builders chose to invest extraordinary effort in creating something impressive and enduring. Subsequent generations chose to maintain rather than abandon. Modern preservationists choose to apply expensive techniques to sustain historical fabric. Taxpayers, through their elected representatives, choose to fund preservation work that provides diffuse benefits rather than concentrated immediate returns. These choices are not inevitable. They reflect values about history, beauty, identity, and responsibility to past and future generations. Different values would lead to different choices. The castle's survival is evidence that these values have prevailed, at least to date, among enough people with enough influence to secure the necessary resources. But values shift. Priorities change. What seems essential to one generation may seem optional to the next. The castle cannot assume eternal support. The case for preservation must be remade continuously, adapted to changing contexts, justified through evolving arguments. Consider standing in the main keep, 7 floors above ground level, looking out through narrow windows across Himeji City and the plain beyond. The view has transformed completely since 1609. The rice fields and scattered villages of the Edo period have been replaced by dense urban development, highways, railways, industrial facilities. The castle, once the dominant feature of the landscape, now stands as an island of the past within the contemporary city. Yet the experience of standing in that space, surrounded by massive timbers and white plaster walls, remains powerful. The scale and craftsmanship communicate across the centuries. You understand physically the ambition required to build this, the labor required to sustain it. The building itself is the argument for its own preservation, more persuasive than any written justification. This is what survives when maintenance succeeds, not just a building, but an experience, a direct encounter with extraordinary human effort and skill. The castle offers this to anyone willing to climb the stairs and engage with the space. This accessibility, this ability to affect people who have no prior knowledge or connection, justifies the expense and effort. Beauty and meaning are not luxuries, but necessities, essential to making human life more than mere functionality. The castle demonstrates what becomes possible when societies choose to invest in permanence, when immediate needs do not entirely consume available resources, when long-term thinking influences resource allocation. These are difficult choices, requiring sacrifice and discipline. The castle stands as evidence that such choices can succeed, that human constructions can endure across centuries, that connections to the past can be maintained through physical preservation. The story of Himeji Castle is not exceptional in kind but in degree. All monuments, all preserved buildings, all maintained heritage sites rest on similar foundations of continuous effort and expense. The specific details vary. The scale differs, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Physical structures decay unless actively prevented, and active prevention requires resources that must be continuously secured through argument and advocacy. What makes Himeji exceptional is the sustained success of that advocacy across 400 years, through multiple existential crises, across fundamental transformations in political and economic systems. The castle has survived not one threat, but dozens, not one near demolition, but several, not one financial crisis, but countless. This accumulated survival represents the choices of thousands of individuals across multiple generations who, faced with the option to abandon or continue, chose continuation. The names of most of these people are lost. They do not appear in histories. Their decisions are documented only obliquely in budget records and administrative reports, if at all. Yet their collective choice made the difference between survival and disappearance. The castle exists as the cumulative result of uncountable small decisions and efforts, aggregating into sustained preservation. This should inform how we understand heritage and preservation. The monuments we admire exist not because they are inherently durable, but because people have made them durable through effort. The appearance of permanence is constructed and maintained. The connection to the past is sustained by work in the present. Nothing survives automatically. Everything requires choice. Who truly paid for this dream? Everyone who contributed labor, money, or advocacy, from the Edo period, farmers delivering tax rice to the modern taxpayers funding restoration work. The cost was distributed across time and population, diluted by that distribution, but real in aggregate. The individual burden was often small. The cumulative cost was enormous. And what does it cost to keep it alive today? Approximately $3 million annually in direct operating expenses, plus the opportunity cost of government funds directed to preservation rather than alternative uses, plus the career dedication of specialists who maintain traditional techniques, plus the administrative effort required to coordinate preservation work across multiple institutions and levels of government. These costs will continue as long as preservation continues. They will likely increase as materials become harder to source, as specialist knowledge becomes rarer, as climate change creates new challenges. The financial model based on tourism revenue and government subsidy appears sustainable for now but faces uncertainties. The deeper cost may be the constant necessity to justify preservation, to make arguments for maintaining the past in the face of present needs. This is exhausting work, requiring passion and persistence, vulnerable to fatigue and changing priorities. The castle's survival depends on people continuing to care enough to fight for resources, to make the case, to do the work. The central question remains: what makes this worthwhile? Why choose to preserve at such cost? The answers are multiple and overlapping. The castle is irreplaceable. Its architectural achievement represents knowledge and skill that cannot be recreated from scratch. Its beauty offers genuine aesthetic value. Its educational function provides understanding of history and traditional techniques. Its economic function through tourism generates employment and revenue. Its symbolic function contributes to cultural identity and continuity. These justifications are real but not self-executing. They require articulation, advocacy, and acceptance by those who control resources. The castle survives because these arguments have succeeded repeatedly, convincing decision-makers to allocate funds, to prioritize preservation, to value continuity over change. This represents a choice about what kind of society to be. Societies that preserve heritage make different statements about their values and priorities than societies that prioritize only contemporary needs. Neither choice is inherently superior. Both involve trade-offs. But the choice determines what survives and what disappears, what future generations inherit, and what they must understand only through descriptions. Himeji Castle exists because Japanese society repeatedly has chosen preservation. That choice has costs. Those costs have been paid, are being paid, and will require payment for as long as preservation continues. The question is whether the value received justifies the cost expended. Stand again at the base of the white walls where we began. As mist rises from the river and obscures the boundaries between stone and air. The castle floats, weightless, perfect. The illusion holds. Behind it, hidden but essential, lies everything that makes the illusion possible. The labor, the money, the decisions, the continuous choosing of preservation over abandonment. The beauty is real. It is also constructed, maintained, and fragile. It survives only through constant effort. The moment that effort ceases, decay begins immediately. There is no neutral state, no pause, only active preservation or passive decline. This is the truth hidden beneath the white walls. Nothing this beautiful survives naturally. It survives because people make it survive, accepting costs that might seem irrational, valuing connection to the past enough to sacrifice resources in the present. The castle is not a gift from history, but an achievement of continuous labor across 400 years. Who truly paid for this dream? Those who built it, those who maintained it, those who fought for its preservation, and those who fund it today. The cost has been substantial, distributed across time but real in every period. The payment continues. And what does it cost to keep it alive? Everything it has always cost: money, labor, expertise, and the sustained decision that beauty and history matter enough to justify the expense. That decision is made or remade daily, in budget allocations, in maintenance schedules, in arguments for funding, in the quiet work of craftsmen applying plaster to ancient walls. The castle stands as long as that decision continues. Its survival is never guaranteed, but always contingent, dependent on people choosing continuation. The white walls will float above the mist tomorrow only if someone ensures the foundations remain sound today. This is the price of beauty. This is the cost of permanence. This is how extraordinary things survive, not through their own strength, but through the continuous, often invisible, always essential effort of those who choose to sustain them. What would you be willing to sacrifice in the present to preserve beauty from the past for people you will never meet in the future?